Hello, dear learners. Welcome to this session on communication for beginners. As I understand, a lot of you who are watching this video today have no underpinnings of communication. You have no prior knowledge of this, or if I say, maybe you do have the knowledge of it, but you have not noticed it in a way a communication learner or a communication expert would. So welcome to this session, and in this session we will be looking at what is communication, the process, the effectiveness, the forms of communication and the barriers of communication. We will also be looking at the various models of communication like the Shannon and Weaver model, the Berlow's model, the Gerbner's model, Newcomb's model and Wesley and McLeans model. So, let us first begin with what communication is. Communication has four basic elements which are a part of it in order to make it possible. These four elements are source, message, channel, and receiver. Now, whenever communication is taking place, it is basically the sharing of experiences from one person to the other person. Now, while this experiences sharing is taking place, the source of communication, so say for example, here I am speaking about communication, so I am the source of the information. From the source, a certain message is being delivered to you. This message is the basic thing that I am communicating to you through this lecture. I am talking about the concepts of communication. You're trying to understand what communication is, what its effectiveness means, etc. This is the message of this communication. And then the third thing is the channel. Here it is technology mediated and you understand the language that I am speaking in. So this is the channel. And the fourth and the important aspect is receiver. You people, the people who are listening and watching this video, trying to understand, trying to process this information in their brains and making meaning of it. So these are the four basic ideas, four basic elements of communication. Having spoken of this, the second aspect is what is effectiveness of communication. When we talk about anything being effective, we are primarily looking at the outcome of something. So if you have, say for example, attempted an exam very well, the outcome will say how well the exam has been attempted. If one student scores more than the other, we usually say that the second student has studied more effectively or the second student has done better. So effectiveness, we can say in terms of communication, is being measured in terms of interpretation of that message and the feedback. Both of these things you would appreciate lie at the receiver's end. When we are talking about interpretation of a message, I am talking a few things. I'm talking certain things about communication, but how you are understanding it, how you are processing it, accepting it is for the receiver to decide, is for you to decide. So this is the interpretation, making meaning of the communication that is coming from me. The second thing is important aspect of effective communication is the feedback process. Until and unless we get feedback from the receiver about whether, say for example, in case of a lecture, whether the student has understood properly or not, when you are on a negotiation table as a marketer, whether you have been able to put across your point or not and whether the second party is buying your argument or not, all that is a part of feedback. So ideally, in order for communication to be effective, one, it must be able to come up with some feedback, and two, the interpretation of the message that has been communicated from the source should be just what the source has intended. If I say something and you understand it differently, that means that the communication has not been effective. Now, having spoken about what communication means and what are the factors, what are the important aspects of effective communication, let us also look at the barriers of communication. When we talk about barriers, there are three basic barriers that we're talking about. One is technical, one is language, and the other is psychological barrier. Let us first talk about the technical barriers. When we are talking about technical barriers, all those kind of barriers that come in communication due to technical reasons, like say for example, message distortion. If instead of hearing my words clearly, you start listening to some gurgling sound, or the streaming of your media stops, then you will not be able to understand what I said. This is a technical glitch. This is a technical distortion of message, right? And that is why this is called a technical barrier. The second thing is wrong timing. You have had 6 hours of hectic work, and then I start teaching you the concepts of communication. That is a wrong time to catch my learner. Yeah. So wrong time is also a barrier in communication. More so a technical barrier, because your brain is already flooded with so much information that you're talking about, you're thinking about, and you have to take an action on. Such that this communication, which is coming from me, ends up coming at a wrong time. Hence, wrong timing is also a technical barrier. And the third is information overload. When already you're thinking of something else and I start teaching you some concept of communication, it becomes communication overload, because the capacity of anyone to take up information is limited. After a certain point of time, there is a saturation, and then there is less and less retention. Right? So this is why information overload is also termed as a technical barrier for communication. The next aspect of these barriers of communication are the language barriers. When we talk about language barriers, there are two things that we must keep in mind as communicators. One is the vocabulary. Like when we talk in journalism, it is very often said that if you throw your reader to the dictionary, the reader will throw you out of the job. So you do not have to make your communication very complicated. The simpler your communication is in any framework, in any context, the better the chances of it being successful, or being more effective, or getting the desired outcome. So one thing is, do not throw your reader or your listener to the dictionary. And the second is semantics. The meaning of the word semantics is to make meaning. So if I am teaching you something and you are understanding something which is contrary to what I have explained, then it is a language barrier. So creation of meaning, how you're making use of words and what kind of meaning it is these use of words is creating for the listener or the viewer, the receiver, is an important aspect. And these are the two language barriers that we're talking about. The third thing is psychological barriers. Amongst the psychological barriers also, we have four major aspects. One is noise, the other is perception set differences, the third is distrust, and the fourth is information filtering. Let us look at each of them separately. Noise. What is noise? Noise is not just something which is distorting the message. Noise is any kind of barrier which is coming between an effective reception of the message and the communication of the message. So any kind of noise could be that you're not able to listen to what I said. It could be that your mind is already clogged with so many things already that you are not able to take in the essence of what I have delivered. So noise can be of multiple ways. Then another thing is perception set differences. If I give you examples that you don't relate to, or you think that these are not correct, then there is a difference in my understanding, my perception of the world, of the way things are, of the society, and your perception of understanding. So here, this difference in understanding between the source and the receiver will also become a barrier. Because when I'm explaining concept or a fundamental, and then when I'm going on to an example, when I'm giving you a way of how you can put it in context, and if you do not agree with that context or you think it is not the reality, there will obviously be a barrier between what I have conveyed and what you have understood. The third thing is distrust. Obviously, whenever when you talk about believing, when you talk about understanding, it happens only when the first thing is trust. The first door to knock is trust. If you think you can trust this information, only then you will spend time thinking about it, or noticing what changes can happen due to it, or processing it in your mind in general. So this is another psychological barrier. If you do not trust a person, you would not like to entertain, or you would not remember what he or she said, or you would not want to entertain any sort of communication from this person. The fourth psychological barrier is information filtering. When we talk about information filtering, you will also notice this in one of the theories of communication when we come to it, that there are various kinds of information, but we like to expose our brains to only few kind of informations or nuggets that are available around us. And which are those which we select? These are the ones which are in accordance to our preconceived notions, beliefs, values, how we've been brought up, etc. So there are multiple personality factors that will help you decide what you would choose. It's like if you go to a restaurant and there is a menu card in front of you. Out of so many items that are listed on the menu card, you choose 2 or 3. Now, which are those 3? Or which are those 2? Those are the ones that you find more palatable, which you find tastier, which you think are healthy, or which are, according to your interest. Similarly, when you open the day's newspaper, or when you browse through the TV channels, you stop on that program which you think is interesting. Right. So this is what we mean by information filtering. You filter out the rest of the dishes in the menu card. You filter out the rest of the news items in the newspaper, or you filter out all the other channels on the TV and stick to one which you like, which you find interesting, which you think can be useful to you. So this is the process of information filtering. So the obvious question would be, why am I placing it in a psychological barrier? Because psychologically speaking, if I believe that women should not work outside their homes, then whatever you are communicating to me about the empowerment of women, or women making their voices heard, or breaking the ceiling, or earning, or being a decision maker, is all a waste. Because the information filtering process has started just when the communication started. So since I do not believe that women should go out into the world and be economically independent, I would negate every other information in context of this that I have been given. This is why information filtering is a psychological barrier of communication. So I hope with this you have understood what communication is, what effective communication is, and what are the barriers of communication. The next part of this lecture talks about the models of communication. And let us go one by one. The first model that we will be talking about is Harold Laswell's model. This is a very famous model, and it basically started coming into the social scientists' purview and context when the theory of limited effects came up. As in, earlier it was thought that media cannot be challenged. Media is a talisman. Media is a magic multiplier. It was also thought that media can do whatever it wants to do to the audiences, and the audiences will not be able to do anything with it. And so the effect that media wants to create, it will be able to create. But Harold Laswell's model speaks something different. And this was the time when social scientists, communication scientists were looking at limited effects of communication. So media is not all powerful. Media does not wield all the power over the receivers, over the listeners, over the viewers of communication. So audiences have their own brain, and they exercise it too, and they make their own decisions based on it. Harold Laswell's model said, who says what, to whom, in which channel, and with what effect. Now, this is a beautiful model. Let us dissect this. Who says? The source of information. What? The message. To whom? The receiver. In which channel? Channel is one of the 4 elements of communication. And with what effect? So the beauty of this model was that this was the first time in social sciences that somebody was talking about effects. The kind of effect a certain communication would have on the audiences will make it effective or ineffective, will decide whether, you're reaching only 6% of the population or 96% of the population with your message. So this is the whole idea of Harold Laswell's model. And the uniqueness of this model was that it was talking about the effects of media content on the public, on the audiences. The second model was Shannon and Weaver's model, and this was a mathematical model. Shannon and Weaver were two mathematicians, and they were working on their own mathematical concepts when they came across this, and it became so popular as a model of communication that they are now well respected names in the world of communication as well. So, this model says there is a source. The source encodes the message, and through a channel, it sends it to the receiver where it is getting decoded. Meanwhile, at any of these steps, while it is encoding or while it is it is getting converted into a message, or the channel has a problem, at any stage, if noise enters, it breaks the communication process. So this noise enter in various ways. Maybe what I want to convey to you is not what I have encoded properly. So there is an encoding problem there. So that is a noise. From encoding, when we talk about the channel, the way I am communicating to you, maybe, okay, I am communicating to you by means of a video, but probably you do not have access to videos, you do not have access to internet or digital media. Again, it becomes a barrier in communication. Then, other than that, the channel and the decoder, what I have said and what you have understood, when there is a difference between these two, that is also a kind of noise. Like we discussed this when we were talking about effective communication. So this makes communication ineffective. This is also a kind of noise. And then when you have heard what I have said, say for example, you are a communication student and I start teaching you astrophysics. Now that is something, the fundamentals of which you will not be able to follow. That again is noise for you. So these two social scientists, Shannon and Weaver, they came up with this concept of noise entering the communication process, the entire process of communication, and how noise affects the process of communication. So this was the second model. Then we had the third model, which is called the Berlow's model. Now, Berlow worked on the four elements, the four components of communication that we initially talked about: the source, message, channel, and receiver. These are the four elements of communication. He spoke about the uniqueness of each of these elements and what each of these elements comprise. So, say for example, when we talk about the source of communication, we say that the source will have source, say for example, in this case is me. The source will have certain kinds of communication skills, will have certain kind of an attitude towards the subject that one is talking about, certain kind of knowledge, certain kind of social system, certain kind of culture, right? So these are the various aspects which come into the personality of, or which come into the perspective of source. So also he talked about message. When we were talking about message, we said, what is a message? A message is what is being decoded by the source. So this message also has certain attributes. What are these? It is the content which has to be communicated, which is being part of message. It is the element, what kind of like we are talking only about the basics of communication, that is the element. Then what kind of treatment it is being given. When you have a lecture where the teacher is giving adequate and enough number of examples for you to understand a concept, is different from what you're reading in a book or maybe an advanced level book. So the kind of treatment that is being given to a communication in order for it to be effectively communicated to the receiver is the treatment. The structure, how are you structuring? Like my lecture is structured in a form that we first talk about the basics of communication, the process, the barriers, then we go on to the models and theories. This is the structure of my communication. And for any communication to be successful, it is important that it be structured in a specific manner. And then of course the code. In this case, the code is language. You understand the language that I'm speaking in, and hence you're able to follow what I'm saying. Right? So these are the 5 elements of message. Then Berlow also talked about the channel. He said that the channel can be anything. Like in this case, if you're listening to my video, your hearing and seeing are the 2 sense organs that you're making use of to acknowledge, to accept, and to communicate. So channel can be hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, seeing, all of this. So all the 5 sense organs. And then he talked about the receiver, which will have the same elements as that of the source, right? Because even if one is missing, it will end up becoming either noise or a barrier in effective communication. So the receiver also has communication skills, just the way the source had them, also has attitudes, also has knowledge, social system, and culture. Now, why is it that the source and the receiver have the same elements? Because communication is a cyclic process. For it to be cyclic, what happens? I am communicating to you, you are processing this information in your brain, then there is a question that you have which is coming to me again as feedback, and I am processing your question, creating its answer in my brain, again giving it back to you. So, this is why communication becomes cyclic. And while this communication is cyclic, the source becomes the receiver and the receiver becomes the source. Hence, it is very important for both source and receiver to have the same elements. That is what Berlow's model spoke about. The next is Gerbner's model. Broadly speaking, Gerbner's model said that perception is different from reality. Any event, let us say E, happens. Now, this event, there is certain kind of selection of event that happens in media. So, because we are talking in terms of communication and mass communication, let us look at it from the perspective of media. So, multiple things, multiple events are happening, but not everything gets covered, in the newspapers every day. It is only selected few that will find coverage in the next day's newspapers or in the television or wherever else. So, an event E has taken place. The selection, context, and availability of its content. Say, for example, an earthquake happened somewhere in some European country, and Indian media does not have an access to it. In that case, they will not be able to present that news. Why? Because availability of facts, availability of the visuals, pictures, everything is necessary for any news to become a part of the media. So, an event has taken place. There is a certain kind of perceptual dimension to that event. Okay. Now, access to channels and the media control is also one. Like something which can be a neutral event can be presented in media to depict that it is a positive event, or it can be depicted in media to give a negative connotation or representation altogether. So, here the perceptual dimension of the reporter or the editor or the news media is coming into picture. Then there is another thing, which is the form and content. Like we were talking about the event's form and content and its dependence on availability and context. Similarly, it is also the form and content of the editor, the media maker, the content provider that is coming into picture now. So while the media content is being affected by the form and content or the perceptual dimension of the editors, the media makers, the reporters, after that it is reaching the audiences. So the receiver's perception of the event that has taken place is not neutral. The event that had taken place was neutral, but the way it is now being perceived by the audience is through the rose-colored glass that the media has provided. Where if it has given it a negative tone, it will be seen by the receiver as a negative with negative connotations. And if it has been given a positive tone, it will be seen as a positive reality by the receiver. So Gerbner said that perception is always different from reality. What you see is not happening. What is happening is different from reality. That was George Gerbner's model. And the next model that we're going to discuss now is the Newcomb's model. I'm sure you must be finding these models really interesting. When you see in around you, when you see in the social context, you would see that these models are actually getting emulgated, models are actually being made use of. You can see them happening around you. Talking of the Newcomb's model, it talked about three factors, A, B, and X. Right? And the model said that the internal relations of two people, now A and B can be two individuals and X can be an object or an idea or another individual, it can be anything. So internal relations of A and B are interdependent, and the equilibrium would exist if A and B have similar attitudes towards X. Just to give you a very neutral example, suppose X is a cafe. I am A and you are B. If I like this cafe X and you like this cafe X, then there will be a greater probability that our meeting point can be this cafe. Alternatively, if I like X and you do not like X, either we will meet less or we will move away from X. Right? So, the interdependence of relations between two individuals A and B will depend on X. Okay, I took the example of a very common cafe. X can be something very important in a person's life. It could be your opinion about the current government. It could be your opinion about the kind of careers that are emerging and what you should do as compared to what your parents tell you to do. So, if there is a mismatch in that, the two individuals will drift across. There will be less communication. So this is the equilibrium model of Newcomb. The next model is Wesley and McLeans model, which talks about existence of filtering mechanism in news. Like when I was talking about George Gerbner's model also, I said that many things are happening around us all the time. Out of these many things, media picks those which it has confirmed sources of of the content that has happened, of visuals, of the facts that have happened, and only then it'll, and which suit its policies. Right. So out of, say, for example, 100 events that have happened, only 50 get selected by a certain media house to be presented to the audiences. Now, out of these, there are various levels of filtering that keep taking place. So this filtering mechanism is happening. Once the reporter has covered it, it comes to the sub-editor's desk and they sieve to see which are the ones that will find a space in the news channel or the newspaper and which will be just thrown out. Then out of that, the way a story is being written, the kind of slant or angle or turn that you will give to that story, whether it is in connivance with the media policy of your media house or not, those kind of editings are taking place. So an event that has happened is not exactly the way it has happened which is getting covered. It is going through certain kind of filtering mechanisms at various levels, and these filtering mechanisms are multiple. You have a sub-editor or a copy editor in a newspaper, and then it goes on to the editorial desk. Then there is a news editor to look at it. Final copy is being checked by the senior heads of the newspaper, and then you decide what is going as news in the newspaper for the next day. So this is what Wesley and McLean pointed at, that there are various kind of filtering mechanisms. So an event which is E can turn into E1 or E2 or E3 depending upon the levels of filtering that it has undergone. So this was Wesley's and McLean's model of communication. So with this, I hope that you have understood the basic concepts of communication, of what is effective communication, what are the various models and theories, and you would also start observing it in your usual lives around you whenever you see media and information that is generated by media, or whenever you are creating media for various media platforms and social platforms. Thank you all very much. Join me again for another session. Thank you.